guys, so a traditional jazz song has the following overall structure. First you play the melody with the underlying chord progression, which is called the head. Then everyone has a go improvising over that same exact chord progression, which is called the solo. And then you finish with the melody over that same chord progression again. And this is known as a head-solo-head form or structure. So the rhythm section, including the piano, just plays the same chords over and over again through the entire performance. So for example, if we take the jazz standard Autumn Leaves, then you would get something like this. So my left hand was playing the exact same chords over and over again for that entire performance of Autumn Leaves. And my right hand played the melody first with a few embellishments, which was the head. Then it had to go improvising over the same chord progression as the solo, and then I returned back to the melody at the end for one more go round and playing the head again. So by the 1960s, this formula had gotten a bit boring, a bit dry, and a little bit sort of cliche and expected. So jazz musicians started experimenting with different ways to structure the overall performance of the song. And one such experiment can be called suppressing the harmonic progression, or suppressing the chord progression. Now this technique was used a lot by Miles Davis's second great quintet, especially when performing live and especially when performing jazz standards. Now the point of playing the head or the initial melody is to introduce the song to the audience so that the listeners know exactly what song they're listening to and what song is about to be improvised over. But there are many jazz standards that every single jazz listener knows better than they know themselves, thus the name jazz standard. And Autumn Leaves is one such standard. Every single jazz musician out there has at some stage in their lives performed Autumn Leaves. So really, there's no need to play the entire head or the entire melody for listeners to recognize the song. So instead of playing the head all the way through, you only really need to play one or two opening phrases so that the audience knows what song you're playing, and then you can immediately start improvising and altering the chord progression. Right, and this is the technique that I've called suppressing the chord progression. But essentially all you do is you take a well-known jazz standard like Autumn Leaves and you play it keeping the underlying form or number of bars and keeping the underlying meter, but changing the chord progression either by sitting on one chord for a long period of time or playing completely different chords with the soloist improvising over the top. And then upon the soloist's signal, returning back to the melody and the proper chord progression. So in this way, you disregard the harmony, but you keep the same underlying form. Now this gives the impression of the band slipping in and out of the song or the melody or the head. But by keeping that underlying meter and the underlying form going, it keeps the whole thing grounded and smooth and still provides a strong link back to the actual song. So for example, instead of playing all the chords written out in the first 8 bars of Autumn Leaves, you could play the chords written out in the first 2 bars to introduce the song, and then just play 4 bars of completely different chords. It doesn't matter what they are, just make them up. And then for the final 2 bars, return back to the actual written out chord progression. Right, so this way you keep the form, those 8 bars are still 8 bars, you keep the underlying meter, I was still playing in 4/4 time, but you disregard the harmony. I was playing completely different chords than the ones written out for those 4 middle bars. But neither the new chords nor the solo were written out beforehand. They were both completely improvised. The band didn't sit down before a performance and agree on what chords to use or what scales to use or when to leave the chord progression or when to come back to the chord progression. So neither player knew what the other was going to do. They just had to listen and follow each other. So then the chords are improvised and the solo is improvised. So the accompaniment could play literally any chord and the soloist could play literally any scale or note. And sometimes they clashed, but that's okay. That's what jazz is. You're allowed to clash. That just creates tension. And so then by leaving the chord progression, you're creating tension, and by then returning back to the chord progression and the actual song and the actual melody, you're resolving that tension. And this technique continued all the way through the song, so it broke that rigid head-solo-head structure. The head wasn't played all the way through at the beginning and the end, and the solos weren't just a chunk in the middle of the song. It was all sort of intertwined throughout the entire performance. So for example, taking Autumn Leaves again, you could get something like this. Now this technique was a direct response to free jazz, which used completely free improvisation without too much regard to form and meter. So in a sense, suppressing the chord progression is controlled freedom because you dispose of the underlying chords and scale so you could freely improvise however you liked, but you still kept the underlying form and the underlying meter and referred back to the song occasionally. So you're still playing the same song, just with some free-ish improvisation chucked in. The written out chord progression is used as a kind of base from which to depart or divert or digress out into some free-ish or freer improvisation. And then you come back to the melody, and so you keep that underlying form, and that's what holds this whole thing together and keeps it quite grounded and neat and structured. Right, so it's not complete freedom or completely free improvisation like you find in free jazz, but rather it's controlled freedom. Freedom with some limitations that references back to the original material. Now, when I was departing or suppressing the written out chord progression, I generally tried to use quartal chords because they give a much more open sound, which gives the improviser or the improvisation more room to play around in. And because you're effectively getting rid of the written out chord progression, the improvisation should generally use motivic development, with the motifs taken from the melody. That is, you should take fragments of the actual melody and then use that as a kind of motif to improvise around. And so this gives your improvisation some melodic structure in lieu of the harmonic structure which is missing because we've gotten rid of the chord progression. And it also helps the listener by referring back to the melody. It sort of rounds the song off, it grounds the song a bit more so that it's not completely out there free improvisation. Even though you've gotten rid of the chords, you're still playing the same song. You're still referring back to that melody, however sort of distantly or abstractly. Now, for some great examples of this technique being used in practice during a performance, have a listen to the albums Miles in Tokyo, Miles in Berlin, and Live at the Plugged Nickel, all of which are Miles Davis albums. Cool, and so that's it for me. Thanks again for watching, and feel free to leave any questions or comments. See ya!